Hello, everyone, and welcome back or welcome to the Defining Endurance podcast. Today, we are talking about burnout. I was lucky enough to connect with Jefferson County Mental Health, which is a local mental health organization here in Colorado. And we are joined today by one of their therapists, Chelsea Vibert. Chelsea, thank you much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
So, to start off, I want to hear a little bit more about you as a practitioner in mental health, as well as Jefferson County Mental Health and what you guys do.
Yeah. So I am a licensed professional counselor. So back in now a decade ago, I did my education in international disaster psychology at DU. So trauma and stress are really my two focuses. And then I specifically specialize and have worked quite a bit with kids. But then after my stint with kids, I managed our COVID response, the Jefferson Center's COVID response team that we had a FEMA grant on. And so oversaw our work for that for our three counties. So Jefferson Center provides community mental health and substance use treatment for Jefferson, Gilpin, and Clear Creek counties, doing all sorts of things from individual counseling to group to medication to really if it falls underneath the mental health umbrella, we do it at Jefferson Center. So supporting that work. And then currently I'm a community engagement coordinator. So looking at how we educate and connect with the community on mental health topics, just like this.
Well, thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate your time. I know you're probably extremely busy, but that goes along with today's topic of busyness. We're going to talk about burnout. So, I think burnout is a term that we use frequently, but maybe don't always have a full concept of what it means for our health or mental health. How do you define burnout?
Yeah, I mean, it's a relatively new term, I think, since COVID and probably the last really like decade. I think it's coming up more and more. Um, but it originated back in the 70s. Originally defined as the extinction of motivation or incentive, especially related to your kind of connection to why you do things, and really looking for those results. But I think burnout's really a term that many of us are familiar with, or we've at least heard of. It's a response to chronic stress from different types of work, involving responsibilities, purpose, expectations, or obligations. And one thing I think too that's really important to note is that in the literature, it, we really sort of saw and talked about burnout only related to work. And what we really found is that like everything is work. Like if you're a parent, that's work. If you caregive for anyone in your life, that is work. And so I think we're really looking at a transition from just sort of your 9 to 5 work to anything that sort of puts that demand or expectation on an individual, which I think everybody experiences and sits with very differently. Um, But according to the WHO or the World Health Organization, burnout is feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, really increased mental distance from or feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job, and then a sense of ineffectiveness and lack of accomplishment.
So, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this with you, and because we are mostly an endurance focused podcast, we talk mostly to athletes or other coaches, is because I've been seeing more and more athletes who are just getting so burned out during their training. They're hitting this point where they just feel like, they're like, this was supposed to be my release, like where I'm supposed to get my stress out. And I'm just feeling like I have too much pressure on myself that I'm not hitting my goals. And I think what you talked about totally hits the nail on the head that, you know, we think of burnout being from a job, but it's so much more. It's, if you're caretaking, if you're also training for several hours a week and putting this expectation that you're going to meet these goals and possibly not meeting those goals or forgetting your why of why you're doing something, totally the reason for burnout. So is there a certain population who's at risk of this, or where do you see it most with the people you work with?
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's especially when you think about, like I said, really the last, I'll say, decade. Um, I think that at some point everyone is at risk for burnout. Um, they're the ones that again are very well researched. So a lot of or just care providers, so healthcare, teachers, mental health workers, those working in the criminal justice system. Um, but I think that we're seeing more and more research come out around just sort of that traditional like mom and pop caregivers. And then to your point too, I think there's quite a bit of um, discussion in individuals who are endurance athletes or just athletes that there's a high demand on, high expectations that they put on themselves. I think more and more we're seeing things come out related to burnout or overtraining in that space. But I really think that there are a couple things that can um, increase your risk around burnout. Lack of feeling of control can be a big one. Lack of recognition around that work. There's this experience too for individuals where the work is maybe monotonous, so it's not challenging enough, or where you don't have the capacity to meet the demands of the challenge. And so that I think really relates to when you think about that, the training aspect, doing the same thing kind of over and over, it loses that edge versus always sort of pushing and pushing. I think in traditional American culture, there is all we are like getters. That is how we classify success. That's how we classify doing a good job in everything, right? Not just endurance athletes or even work, but just like caregiving, who we are and how we show up. So much is driven by being the best or doing the most, and so that component is a big piece of adding to burnout and that stress of burnout. And so those are all kind of lifestyle things, right? Working too much, not taking breaks, not having close supportive relationships, having a lot of responsibilities, not getting enough sleep. And then there are also the idea, right, of personality traits. And so when you think, especially I'm imagining about your endurance athletes, you are good at what you do because you are a hard worker. You might have a tendency to be perfectionistic. Um, there's always a way to do something better and to do it faster and harder and stronger. And so some of those personality traits can also contribute to burnout or maybe the risk of burnout.
No, those are like I think thinking of my athletes that I work with, I totally see where you're coming from with that. Where when people are really driven, they're also at that risk of burning out. Um, so there's definitely some topics that you discussed that I want to go back to with kind of the work culture, and then maybe also one of the questions that people wanted us to bring up was fear of missing out or FOMO. But before we go into that, I want to talk a little bit more about you know um, is there any way to prevent burnout, or is it just kind of inevitable with the lives that we're living?
I mean, I think that obviously, yes, there are ways to prevent it. And I think that it would be remiss of me not to say, like we will probably all experience and kind of sit with some of the symptoms of or the presentation of burnout. Um, because a lot of it is just sort of ingrained, I think, into our culture and the way in which we engage with each other. So I think to say like, oh, this is 100%, if you do these 6 steps, you'll never feel burnt out. Um, that just isn't probably accurate, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do to prevent it. So when you think about burnout, it's sort of at its core, it's an imbalance between the demands that you put on yourself, that your community, your work, your family, the list kind of goes on, but the demands in your life don't match up with your resource or the resources that you have. And so really it's trying to figure out how to increase your resources because for a lot of these things, right, the demands may not be changeable. When I think about caregiving, I have to caregive every day. And even when I get to go on a trip by myself or do something that sort of refills my bucket, I still am caregiving. I still need to go to work every day to pay bills. When you think about training and really wanting to be a top athlete and be competitive, that there's a component of rest that is important and a component of like there is some innate hustle, I think, that can come with being at the top of your game. So it really is sort of looking at how do we increase our resources. And that can look like so many different things. And again, right, this idea of if I could tell you 6 things and everyone on listening in would only do those 6 things, then they'll feel better. When really, I think it's much more complicated than that. So, what I would really encourage is sort of the first step for me is really getting clear on values, being really specific about sort of why you show up in the way that you show up and what are my values. I think for me, when COVID hit, prior to all those experiences, my life was rather sort of like, I went to did my things were pretty easy. I didn't have to give my life and the way in which I engaged with other people, myself, much thought. And with COVID, a lot of things had to stop and change. I had to pivot in a lot of the ways in which I took care of myself. And it really made me question, in a way that I hadn't for like, what are my values? Like, why am I doing the stuff that I'm doing? Because I don't have time to do it all. A lot of it's inaccessible to me, right? Like, I'm not going to hot yoga um, with my with my mask on. Like, there were a lot of things that I had to reconsider. And so getting really clear on your values, and doing a really thorough assessment. Because I think too, right, in American culture, there are some values I think that are culturally really encouraged. And I think of like Army Corps kind of things like trust, integrity, honor, which are beautiful. And if you're listening and you're like, yeah, those are mine, like that's fantastic. Those are not mine, I discovered. Those are great. I try to, be trustworthy and honest. But really for me, it was so much more about connection, and learning. And I mean, the list kind of went on. And so being really clear about how is it that I'm engaging in the world in a way that honors my values and makes space for them. And that's not always done at work. And so knowing that there are lots of different avenues and spaces for engagement, like maybe it is with your hobbies, maybe it is with your community outside of, but really making sure that you diversify getting those values met, um, was a big one for me. And then, kind of in the backside of that, when you are really clear on your values and what's meaningful, it makes setting boundaries a lot easier. And so, by having clear boundaries and saying, this serves me and my values, and maybe my company values or the values of the group of people that are important to me, the ability to say yes and no gets a lot easier and more accessible. And just how important boundaries are in how you show up for yourself and support yourself. Um, I think that's a really big next step. And then, too, it's all about taking stock, right? Looking at your values and looking at your boundaries and saying, is this working? Is this not working? Do I need to tweak here, cut back here, increase here? It's all about self assessment and self awareness, and just how important those pieces are, that I think we don't always teach our young people good skills on that. And you really have to learn those as a grown up. And so, obviously, being engaged in therapy, having a strong social support, all of those things really add up. And then my last one is like just stopping. Like, if your job is not serving you, then I think it's maybe time to find a new job. If the things you're doing are not serving you, you don't have to keep doing them, and being okay with that.
No, those are amazing points. And I think that, as a coach who's worked with athletes for several years now, I've seen several athletes get burned out, and it's having those conversations of like, okay, how can we make this more enjoyable for you? How can we adjust this workout? Okay, that's not working. Like, why do you enjoy running? Let's think about why you want to sign up for this race. What does it bring you? It's, not everyone's elite, right? Like, and so it's not that we all have to do it for work. Sometimes it's because this is what makes you feel validated outside of your 9 to 5. But if that's not working, it's like, okay, what do you need from me? How can I support you? And then sometimes it is just stopping and saying, like, cool, maybe you need a few months off to go do something else. Like, maybe this is a time to find another sport you like, or get into watercoloring, or just something else that's going to kind of fulfill that other part of your life. And then, of course, I think if we're feeling burned out in our job, it's so easy to feel burned out in everything else. So I think those are great points, to just kind of have that self-awareness, to know what you actually need and what is actually bringing you down, whether it's a bad relationship, it's, working and then coming home and taking care of a tiny human that's exhausting, or it's, that you're not feeling fulfilled in those things that bring you relief. So we've talked about, is there any way to prevent it? We've talked about kind of how to repair from it. What happens if you just go too far? Like, is there, physical things that can happen to your body? What can happen to you mentally if you just let that burnout take over?
Yeah. I mean, it can look like so many different things, um, in a lot of different settings. And really, so things to look out for, maybe like some symptoms, is this idea that every day kind of feels like a bad day. Um, it just really never makes a turn. It seems like kind of everything is not worthwhile. It's a waste of energy, feeling exhausted. Um, and really, it feels like nothing you do makes a difference, or it's just not really appreciated. And so, again, it's really going to start with that initial self assessment. So, some questions that I really like to ask, and you can rate these on a 1 to 5, 1 to 10, right? One being like the lowest, and five being the highest. Um, how overwhelmed or exhausted did I feel? How critical or cynical did I feel? How productive did I feel? And how much fun did I have? And so really just having these conversations with yourself, because before, right, we can cross that line to where it's really kind of feeling like chronic burnout, when every day is sort of a slog, and it's maybe leaked into other areas of our life. Like you had mentioned, right, it started at work, and now it's just kind of everything feels listless and meaningless. So really starting with that initial assessment, and then looking, there's going to be lots of different ways to kind of be aware of it, right? Emotionally, maybe a sense of failure, self doubt, feeling helpless, trapped, and defeated. Decreased satisfaction and sense of accomplishment. So maybe you're meeting some of these milestones or goals that you're setting for yourself, but they just don't feel the same. A loss of motivation, and just feeling really detached and alone. And then physically, physical is a really common one, and it's kind of the one of the landmarks when you think about burnout. So feeling tired and drained most, if not all the time. Frequent illnesses, and so you might even see this with athletes, right? It's this having more injuries, and looking like lots of different ways, more headaches, more muscle pain, changing appetite or sleep habits. And so that can go both ways. What we see with sleep habits tends to be getting less sleep. But again, every person's different. So maybe getting way more sleep than needed, not being able to get out of bed, changing an appetite, just not eating as much, or even really overeating or eating foods that don't always feel like they fuel our body in a meaningful way. And then behaviorally, withdrawing from your responsibilities, kind of isolating yourself. Maybe it looks like procrastinating or taking a really long time to get things done. This is a space where maybe we might see substance use, and drugs or alcohol, being frustrated and aggressive with others, skipping out on work or other responsibilities. All of those things are signs and symptoms, I suppose, to look for when we think about burnout.
No, I think all of those, either I've seen people go through or I've experienced myself when I've been in that place of burnout. Especially like little things like, when we're low in energy, our body craves carbohydrates, and so if you're just kind of like emotionally low, I think we do the same thing. That not sleeping, like so many times we justify, we're like, oh well, I've been stressed or I had to do stuff, but it's just you have that restlessness. I think those are all things that we tend to kind of ignore in our American culture is, well, yeah, you're supposed to be tired if you're working hard, but really you're not.
Mhm.
Tiredness is not necessarily a good thing or means that you're doing everything you're supposed to. So I'd like to kind of go circle back to reasons that we might experience burnout. You touched on it a little bit, but COVID, how did the pandemic and quarantine affect people? And then now that we're coming back into the world, do you think that will affect our feelings of burnout?
Yeah. I mean, I think, right, when you think about some of that ways to reduce burnout, so much of it for so many people were these things that I think we were able to just kind of do, right? I could go to hot yoga, I could go on a run or a walk with friends, like the way in which I connected, things weren't really questioned. And right, and I think all of this really there underlines this ability to feel like we're in control of our lives. Um, and so much of COVID, I think, was this lack of control. Really, this way that there were so many unknowns really early on, and it was very confusing. And I don't think anybody really had a good handle on um, what was coming down the pipe and how to best respond and how to support our neighbors. And I, like I mentioned earlier, right, my specialty is in disaster psychology and how we respond, and just so much of disaster is kind of community connection and bringing people together. And I think it was just a really divisive experience for so many people. Um, However you identify and kind of express your thoughts, I think it was hard. And so, right, and like I mentioned earlier as well, this idea that like, why do I do the things that I do? Everything is out of control. Everyone kind of needed to redefine and reestablish our pillars of meaning. What is meaning? What is life? Why do we do anything that we do? And how do I make it all make sense? Um, we sort of collectively were shaken, and I think there's still loads of reverberations happening. I mean, I think there are still lots of challenges for people who experienced COVID directly. There were so, I mean, we've lost so many individuals. And so there's this, it's wrapped up in grief, it's wrapped up in how we take care of ourselves and how we respond to our needs. Um, and I think there was also this new added component, especially when we think about work, is that everything happened at home. Some people, and for the people who still had to go to work, like that was an incredibly challenging time when we think about burnout being so impactful for healthcare and educators. Those were some of our frontline, and they have always been our frontline workers. And so there was that obvious challenge, but like for a lot of us, work came into our homes in a really intimate way where boundaries were really hard. It was easy to check my phone at 7 o'clock and just shoot an email off, and not listen to what my body needed. And then my access maybe to my local gym, my yoga studio, my favorite place to sit down and have a happy hour with my girlfriends, like all of these things were challenged. I had to spend a lot more time with my husband, who I love dearly. I do not know that I love him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for two and some change years. He's fantastic. No one is fantastic that often. Um, and when you think about caregivers for like the traditional sort of a home structure, my child was home a lot more. My child wasn't able to be vaccinated. Like there are just so many things that sort of piled onto your plate. And if you didn't have those pillars of what are my values and how do I set up boundaries to protect my mental health, to protect my family, and then right, and then I think it just sort of echoes like a stone in a pond, those ripples, right? Myself, me and my partner and our child, our then our extended families, and then my community here in Denver, and I'm from Kansas and he's from New York, then those communities, and then the United States, and then this was a global disaster. And so there's just so many things. And when you pile on the fact that it wasn't just COVID that we were experiencing, there were loads of other issues, and there continue to be natural and man-made disasters in the United States and around the world. Um, there's a lot, unfortunately, there's a lot to be sad about and to feel challenged around. Um, and it's really easy, I think, to get swept up.
Oh, for sure. And I think like, I think if we were to talk about everything going on in the world, it would just go on for hours. So we'll try and keep it to a minimum. But I do think that affects so much of, our ability to relax is when there's, horrible things in the news that you feel so helpless about. And you're seeing all these things happen. I was very fortunate, but we live in Louisville, Colorado, which caught
Yeah.
on fire this winter. And it was,
Mhm.
seeing our neighbors having to rebuild and just like that trauma. And then you think about what it's like to be a teacher currently and that kind of trauma that they're experiencing. And then a healthcare provider. Like, it's a challenging world we're living in, and it's difficult to escape. You turn on the news or the radio and you're hearing of something else that just brings you down a bit. Um, So, and then that's my other thought is like now that things are opening up, now that people are engaging again, is it possible that we're putting too much on ourselves?
I mean, it's most likely that we put too much on ourselves. I mean, again, right? Like, even the thought of, and I'm sure for some of your like oh, now we can start to get back to all of these things. And like getting back to is a lot. I think for some families, and I say families not just sort of like mom, dad, and baby, but just like people who shared space. Like it's like, oh, I can breathe. When COVID happened, there was this like dropping of expectations in like a really nice, like it, it wasn't all bad for everyone. Like there was components of it where like, oh wow, like we get to have dinner at home every night together because we can't go to restaurants, and there are new restrictions on things, like um and there was some niceness. And I think that figuring out of how to get back and what you want to get back to is so important. um and so I think that like that being really clear about your values, how you're going to show up, and when you're not going to show up, and just really having those distinctions becomes so important. Because I think that like I am extroverted to my like my deepest fibers. Like if there is a chance for me to go out and about, I am going to do it. um and like that like bounce back for me was so shocking to go from like my little nest of my home to back out into doing so many things and putting demands on myself that I like even I got sort of like socially fried on the edges, and really needed to think about like how do I engage with my life again? How do I make meaning, and how do I set up systems and structures and that really support me? Because right, like we've kind of been talking about, like stress is everywhere. There's even the idea of eustress, which is fun and exciting, positive stress that enhances your function. It's kind of in the short term. It can increase your performance and focus. So especially when you think about endurance athlete, right? Like there's a very thin line between pushing yourself really hard, because you need to have a little bit of and I'll use this phrase, but a little bit of like a breakdown when you think about muscles or social. You need a little bit to bounce back up just that tiny bit stronger, and so that window is so important. And so how we navigate that window of challenge, and doing enough and being enough I mean, it's hard. And so when you think about coming back from the experience last two and some years, it's challenging. And so being kind to ourselves and having space and patience for those experiences is really important.
And I think that's just so important to remember is that, we don't have to come back the exact same as we were in the winter of 2019, spring of 2020. It's going to be different. So the other thing I wanted to talk about again is we mentioned kind of the American work culture, but then also I feel so many, especially younger people, have moved to kind of like the gig economy or like kind of the having the side hustle. So when we and I know I totally listeners of the podcast might know from other episodes that I worked in the mental health field for most of my 20s, and I definitely was, trying to finish grad school and work two jobs and work intense jobs, and that's what caused me to burn out and do a complete, 180 in my life and what I do for work. But I think that there is this whole idea of like, you can have more freedom if you work a lot, but how could that affect our burnout or having these multiple careers rather than just one 9 to 5?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a component of this challenge that's like you in a way uniquely American. I think other cultures have it, but I really think that there is this like structure in which we kind of live and abide of consumerism and needing all of the things. And there's just the reality. And I think that's really what you're touching on right now is the reality of if you want to live in Denver, you may need two jobs, and you may need to um, have even more than that. And that I think that, and then you kind of couple that with this, like you can always be doing more. And I think in our society, people have this assumption that it equates with more money as well. And when you think about your values, right? And this is one that I'm always so interested in this idea of when you talk about values that sometimes people identify like this freedom, and how much freedom is only accessible in the United States with dollars. Um, whether that's traveling or being able to feed your body foods that feel good, or participate in physical activities that feel good for your body. Sometimes those come with dollars. To be able to engage in some of your self care things come with dollars. Um, Access in the United States is very much informed by and directed with how much money you make. Again, very much in a metro as expensive as Denver. And so some of these things, right, when you say like your question earlier of like, is it inevitable? Like, can we prevent it? And I think that at some point we do have to have a really serious conversation about, like, as a society, about like so many things are inaccessible, and they're only accessible if you really grind to a point that makes that freedom, right? That thing that I'll use freedom as my phrasing, but everyone has a different word for it. Like that made it like the why. So for some people, it's like to have that flexibility in my schedule and that freedom, and I think we can lose out on that. And so much of that is unfortunately related to, like, it does take a hustle. And I think that there are components that you, right, like there's no denying that, like, especially if you're a single parent, a single income household, um, that like you can't escape the hustle and like the financial drive. But I think that there are a couple pieces that you can try to use as your guiding light. So like continuing to hamper on this like values boundaries piece, but really thinking at having goals and setting up goals, so that you have clear indications of where your focus and energy go. um, really getting clear on what you want and where you want to be, um, is a great place to start. And then reframing like how you engage with these things, especially when you think about, right, burnout and this idea of cynicism, like it's just not worth it. What's the point? Really being able to sit with your goals and talking about, like, why do I want to do this? Um, what's my approach? How am I going to? And then being flexible, because there are always roadblocks and always things that come up that um, stymie our progress. And then two, really being clear about the want tos versus the have tos. Finding a balance is really involved in sustaining and supporting motivation. But I also think like it's so important to know, and I think I'm kind of coming back to what I was speaking to just a little bit ago, like there are systems of inequity that are present all the time. And so I think to knowing that you have ownership on how you feel, and own, like figuring out really where you have ownership. And then there are things that you don't have any control over, like how outrageous rent is, and that sometimes you will have to work, and you might even have to work hours or shifts or different kinds of work that are not fulfilling. Um, and like that may be the truth right now, and that doesn't necessarily mean that that's right or that's equitable. There are lots of things that are wrong with sort of how the system is run in terms of access to care and all of these things. Um, and recognizing what you have control over, the way you set goals and how you engage with those goals, is really where you're going to find the most meaningful shift in yourself, because there are lots of things that we're not going to be able to change. Lots of things that we don't have any control over. So finding those points that you can really be present with yourself and engage in a meaningful way with yourself, um, those points of control are really important.
And I think all this ties into the last question that we had, that people had brought up. Something that is kind of tied to that is that whole idea of fear of missing out, or FOMO. And I think when I first heard that, I was like, "What is that?" Like, I had trouble connecting that to burnout when people kept asking, and I was like, "I mean, I guess I'll bring it up." But I think that kind of what you're talking about is like right on the cusp of that. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on how it's.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, again, right, we live in a very much like a consumerism based world. And thinking about how many things you um, I was just listening to a podcast the other day on parenting related to sleep. And if your kid's not sleeping well, then there's a product for you to buy. There's a thing for you to be doing. You can buy this like very expensive baby wiggler that will just like gently shake your baby to sleep. And it's like, oh, I have to buy that.
Oh, the snoo that costs
Yeah.
just under $2,000. Oh,
Yeah.
I've heard of it.
I know. And you think like, oh, if I could buy that thing, then my child will sleep. And I used children sleeping because I think even if you don't have kids, you can like viscerally understand what it possibly feel like to not sleep enough. And if you do have kids, like no matter how much you spent on a sleep package, you know that like bone tired feeling. But if I just bought the right pair of shoes, if I just bought the right experience, if I just so I think that's a component of it, right? Like that there is other people are moving forward with their life. Other people are making more money. Other people have kids sleeping all night. Other people are faster, better, stronger. And if I just do this little bit more, then that'll be enough. And I think right when we talk about this, I think at its very like deepest core experiences, like then I'll be worthy. Then I will be enough. And how much of that again, right, is very much our culture in American society, but then like really unpacking the like, what am I missing? What am I missing out on when you think about FOMO? Like, and again, I'm extroverted, so if I see like people are at Red Rocks for a show that I wanted to go to but forgot to get tickets to, I'm like, no, I know that was a good time. So they're like, things like that. But I think that really when you unpack it, it's the what do I think I'm missing out on? And what does that say about me that I'm not better, faster, stronger, in whatever, right? A better parent, that I'm not running as fast as some, like, I think that there are so many instances of comparison that aren't like new, I think, to 2022. Um, and it's not just, I think, people will often correctly in a lot of ways point to social media, all of those, like, but there, I mean, I think there's just, I think it has always been there, right? Like even when there wasn't, like someone else did something like that. I think it's just we're human. We have this drive, um, and it has benefited us so wonderfully in so many ways. Like when you think about the successes you have and the wonderful things you've accomplished in your life, it's because you were driven. It's because you were passionate, and it might even be because of those feelings of FOMO or like missing out on opportunities. Um, and so again, right, this balance between really pushing yourself while also making space for rest. Um, it's hard. It's incredibly hard, and so 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 important um, for your mental health, your physical health, social, emotional, intellectual. I mean, all versions of yourself. Um, but man, such a challenge.
No, and I think about what you talked about with kind of like living that values driven life. And like, I think it's hard when you are comparing yourself to others and you're maybe trying to live someone else's values, just kind of stay on the whole, you know, having kiddos, uh, analogies is like, I know for me, like, coming back from having a baby and seeing other postpartum women who are just crushing it running again. And I was like, I'm barely like half the
Mhm.
speed I was a year ago. Like, this is such a different life I am living. Like, and like, it's hard because I'm just like, are they getting sleep? Like, are they sleeping better than me? Are they lifting more? Are they like, better at finding a babysitter they can afford? Like, how are they doing this? And really, it's just like my values at that time were to be doing something else, and their values were to be doing something else, and neither of us were doing it wrong. But it was so hard for me to have that clarity in the moment because I think
Mhm.
whether it's on social media or your next door neighbor or like that anecdotal story you heard from a friend, like it's just hard to not compare yourself. Um, so no, I think that, kind of that adage that comparison is the thief of joy is totally
Mhm.
true when it comes to our experience. Um, Before we close out, any last thoughts on burnout or what people can do to kind of keep themselves going as we, move through another month of kind of sad, hard news and getting ourselves into the summer?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of my big things are like, don't try to do it all alone. Like, turn to other people, develop and strengthen a community of individuals who have similar values to you, but also those who have dissimilar values to you. Like, don't shut off someone just because, like, they're not going to show up in the same way that you are. Like, diversify your group of people that you engage with. Ultimately, just find the people who encourage you and build you up. So really having that strong network, and then just get clear on your priorities. Really figure out, how am I going to be, and know that it's going to change every day. Right? I can have my priorities, but I will tell you, if my toddler wakes up more than one time in the night, like those, like my priorities, instead of 10, I'm lucky to get 2. Um, and where can I drop a ball? I really love this analogy about juggling, which I cannot juggle. Um, but it's I think a dying art. But it's the analogies on juggling, and so this idea of we are all juggling tens of things, hundreds maybe of things, depending on how you decide to break it down. And some of those balls are rubber, and so if you drop it, it bounces right back up. And I often think that for the most part, my partner and I have like a pretty rubber relationship. If I snip at him because he didn't put the dishes in the dishwasher, that bounces back up and I have another chance to fix it. But then there are some that are glass that if I drop this very important ball, I may not be able to pick it back up again. And so really being clear on how can I turn as many glass balls to rubber balls as possible? How can I set myself up with systems and habits so that and I often think of meal planning because I hate meal planning, but it's like the best example that if I would just plan my meals out, that becomes a rubber ball because I know we have chicken in the freezer because I planned it out. And I know that on Tuesday, whatever day it is, we're having this. Versus if I don't plan and I get home and I'm like, oh, shoot, I don't know what we're eating. I don't have time to go to the grocery store. Here, toddler, have a banana. Like, the more you can make those glass balls into rubber balls, it really streamlines and creates room for you to question your values, for you to question the way you show up in the world. So creating those systems and habits that support your success, dependent on a community of people who support and love you and maybe are really similar to you, but also really dissimilar in a lot of meaningful ways. Um, those are, for me, at least, really the basis of like a strong, well-rounded life. Put you on a good foot.
So normally we end, asking people where we can find them. I think what might be nice to hear is one, if someone feels like they're really struggling, who they can reach out to. What might be some good local, like you don't know every local website for every crisis center, I am sure, but where people can generally find where to go, or if they're here in Colorado, how they can get connected with Jefferson County Mental Health if needed.
Yeah. So Jefferson Center is, like I said, the community mental health provider for Jefferson, Gilpin, and Clear Creek counties, and we have a walk-in crisis center. We're located right off of I-70 in Watts. We're at 4643 Wadsworth Boulevard, right in Wheat Ridge. And so this is a 24/7, 365 walk-in and speak with a provider from Jefferson Center around any of your mental health needs, whether that's having suicidal ideation, general depression, really anything in any way that we can support with, especially around crisis intervention. And then also similar, kind of related to that, we have the state of Colorado has a crisis talk line. And so you're able to call 844-493-TALK or 8255 and speak with a provider immediately at any time again regarding any mental health needs that you have, any concerns. You can also text TALK to 38255. And these are two really great resources, just sort of for individuals who are experiencing a crisis, but anything along those lines. Feel free to reach out at any time. And then specifically for Jefferson Center, so like I mentioned, we see people of all ages for a huge variety of diagnoses around mental health and substance use. We also have psychiatrists to help with medication management and really any most mental health needs. We are here and able to help, and we have locations all over Jefferson County and then a few in Gilpin and Clear Creek. And so our number is 303-425-0300. And those are two really great places to start. And if you're just not sure, calling Jefferson Center directly and connecting with, we have navigation specialists who can help with resource connection. Let's say you live in a completely different county, you're over in Denver or you're in Summit, we can help get you connected to the providers giving services there.
No, years ago I worked at the crisis center in Arapahoe, Douglas County, and we had a big book of every other county.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely wherever you are, you can always reach out. People will want to help you. Chelsea, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And we'll hopefully have someone from Jefferson Center on later this summer as we continue a series on mental wellness. But enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you so much.